Welcome, weary traveler, to the mysteries that lie at the very end of the world. Tonight, we venture into the ringed city, humanity's prison sanctuary, where time itself bends around ancient secrets. Here, at the boundaries of existence, Princess Filianore sleeps her eternal slumber, while the dark soul of man whispers its deepest truths. This is a tale of gods and pygmies, of light and shadow intertwined in ways that challenge everything we thought we knew. So settle in, let your mind drift, and allow yourself to be carried into the final chapter of a dying world story. In the beginning, before memory became legend, and legend faded into the mists of forgotten ages, there existed a world so different from our own that it might have been carved from the dreams of sleeping giants. This was the Age of Ancients, a time when the very concepts of change and mortality were as foreign as warmth to stone or song to silence. The world in those primordial days was a realm of eternal grey, where great stone dragons ruled over landscapes that had never known the touch of flame or the blessing of true light. These ancient worms were not creatures in the sense we might understand them now, but rather living embodiments of permanence itself, their scales harder than mountains, and their immortality as vast and unchanging as the grey skies that stretched endlessly above their domain. There was no death in this world, because there had never been true life. No light because darkness itself was unknown, no heat because the very concept of cold had yet to be born. It was a realm of perfect stasis, where nothing ever began and nothing ever ended, where the only sound was the whisper of wind across stone wings, and the only movement was the slow, deliberate flight of dragons whose paths had been traced in the sky for eons beyond counting. Yet beneath this seemingly eternal tranquility, in the deepest caverns where even the dragons rarely ventured, something stirred that would change the nature of existence forever. Hidden in the darkness that existed before darkness had meaning, 4 souls waited to be discovered, 4 sources of power so profound that they would shatter the grey world's perfect stillness and usher in an age of impossible wonders and terrible sorrows. The creatures that found these souls were barely more than shadows themselves in those ancient days, beings that had crawled from the dark places of the world where even the dragon's eternal vigilance could not penetrate. They were small and seemingly insignificant compared to the mighty worms that ruled the surface, yet within their frail forms burned the spark of something that the dragons, for all their power and permanence, had never possessed. When these humble creatures reached out with trembling hands to touch the souls that blazed like captured stars in the cavern's depths, the very foundations of reality began to shift and crack. The first flame burst into existence with a brilliance that had never been seen or imagined, casting light and shadow for the first time in the world's long history, creating the fundamental forces that would drive all change and growth for ages to come. 4 Lord souls emerged from that primordial fire, each one carrying within it the power to reshape the world according to its nature. The first was claimed by a being who would become known as Gwyn, the Lord of Sunlight, whose soul burned with the fierce radiance of lightning and the golden warmth of summer's height. His was the power of light itself, the force that would banish the grey twilight and bring warmth to a world that had never known the comfort of flame. The second soul was taken by the Witch of Izalith, whose essence became intertwined with the primal forces of fire and creation. Through her power, the secrets of pyromancy would be born, and the ability to kindle flame from nothing but will and desire would spread throughout the world. She was the mother of flame in its most creative aspect, the force that would kindle hearths and forge metals, and bring the warmth of life to communities that had never known such comfort. The third soul fell to Gravelord Nito, the first of the dead, whose domain would become death itself in all its myriad forms. Where the other lords brought light and fire and life, Nito brought the concept of ending, the necessary balance that would give meaning to existence by ensuring that all things must eventually pass away. His was perhaps the most essential gift of all, for without death, life itself would be merely another form of the eternal stasis that had defined the grey world. And the fourth soul, perhaps the most mysterious and misunderstood of all, was claimed by a figure so humble and self-effacing that history would remember him only as the furtive pygmy. Unlike the other lords who would proclaim their power and build great kingdoms in their own honor, this small being took his dark soul and retreated into the shadows, content to let others claim the light, while he nurtured something entirely different. The dark soul was unique among the four great powers, for where the others were singular and concentrated, this one was meant to be divided and shared. It carried within it the essence of humanity itself, the spark that would one day kindle in the hearts of countless mortals and give them the capacity for growth, change, and the peculiar mixture of nobility and folly that would define their species. These four lords, now wielding power that dwarfed even the mighty dragons, understood that their age of hiding in dark caves was over. The grey world that had seemed so permanent and unchangeable suddenly appeared fragile and outdated, a relic of a time before fire had shown them what was truly possible. The ancient dragons, those living symbols of eternal stasis, now seemed less like gods and more like obstacles, standing in the way of a brighter, more dynamic future. The war that followed was unlike anything the world had ever seen, for it was the first true war, the first time that the concept of conflict had been given form and purpose. The dragons fought with all the power of ages, their stone scales turning aside attacks that would have leveled mountains, their breath freezing the very air and turning the ground to crystal where they passed. Yet for all their might, the dragons were creatures of the old world, beings who had been shaped by an age when change itself was impossible. They could not adapt, could not grow, could not learn from their defeats in the way that the lords and their followers could. Where the dragons saw only another challenge to be endured with their eternal patience, the lords saw opportunity for growth, for learning, for becoming something greater than they had been. Gwyn's lightning could strip the stone scales from dragons that had weathered eons, leaving them vulnerable to weapons and sorceries that had never been able to touch them before. The Witch of Izalith's flames could melt the very foundations of their mountain strongholds, turning their ancient fortresses into flowing rivers of molten rock. Nito's power over death could reach even beings that had never truly lived, bringing them the ending they had never known they needed. And in the shadows of this great war, the furtive pygmies' children began to multiply and spread, sharing fragments of the dark soul among themselves and growing in strength and cunning with each passing generation. These early humans were small and seemingly fragile compared to the mighty lords they served, yet they possessed something that even their divine patrons sometimes envied: the ability to change, to grow, to become more than they had been. It was humanity that learned to forge weapons in the fires of the abyss, creating arms and armor that could stand against dragon scale and dragon fire. It was human cunning that discovered the weaknesses in the dragon's seemingly perfect defenses, human courage that charged into battle, knowing that death was not only possible but likely. And it was human determination that kept fighting even when the war seemed hopeless, even when the dragon's retaliation threatened to reduce the world to ash and ruin. The Ringed Knights, those early champions of humanity who would one day become legends in their own right, stood among the ranks of dragon slayers with their heads held high and their weapons gleaming with dark fire. Each of these warriors was a testament to what humanity could achieve when guided by noble purpose, their skill and bravery earning them a place alongside the gods themselves in the Great War's most crucial battles. When they returned from their campaigns against the ancient dragons, the Ring Knights bore with them the heads of archdragons as trophies, proof of victories that would have seemed impossible in the Grey World's eternal twilight. Yet their contributions to the war, essential as they had been, were never celebrated with the same enthusiasm that greeted the victories of their divine commanders. Perhaps this oversight was simply the result of the natural hierarchy that had emerged from the discovery of the Lord Souls, with the gods occupying positions of supreme authority while humanity served in supporting roles. Or perhaps, even in those early days of victory and celebration, the seeds of future tragedy were already beginning to sprout in the minds of those who had witnessed what the dark soul could accomplish when properly directed. For Gwyn, the Lord of Sunlight whose radiance had banished the grey twilight forever, the victory over the dragons was both a triumph and the beginning of a new kind of fear. He had fought to create an age of fire, a time when light and warmth would drive back the darkness and bring prosperity to all who dwelt beneath his golden radiance. Yet even as he savored his victory, he could not escape the knowledge that his age, like all ages, must eventually come to an end. The prophecy that haunted his dreams spoke of an age of dark that would follow his age of fire, a time when the flames would fade and the world would be ruled by those who carried the dark soul within their hearts. This was not merely a political concern about succession or power, but something deeper and more troubling, a fundamental challenge to everything he believed about the nature of existence itself. Gwyn had defined himself through light, had built his identity around the concept of driving back the darkness and bringing illumination to a world that had never known such radiance. The idea that darkness might not be evil, that it might in fact be the natural state toward which all things tended, struck at the very core of his being, in ways that mere political opposition never could have. This fear, this creeping dread that his greatest achievements might be nothing more than a temporary interruption in the natural order, began to change the Lord of Sunlight in ways that were subtle at first, but would eventually transform him into something very different from the noble deity who had led the war against the dragons. The same power that had made him a great leader in war began to corrupt him in peace, turning his protective instincts into something darker and more controlling. Where once he had fought alongside humanity as equals in the great struggle against the dragons, now he began to see them as potential threats, carriers of a darkness that might one day challenge his authority and bring about the end of everything he had built. The humans who had served him faithfully, who had bled and died for his cause, suddenly seemed less like allies and more like problems to be managed and controlled. This transformation was not sudden or dramatic, but rather a slow erosion of trust and fellowship that would eventually lead to consequences more terrible than any battlefield defeat. The seeds of humanity's long exile, their centuries of suffering and isolation, were planted in these moments when fear began to override the gratitude and fellowship that had once defined the relationship between gods and mortals. Yet in those early days, when the victory over the dragons was still fresh and the Age of Fire was just beginning to unfold its golden promise, few could have imagined where this path would lead. The world seemed bright with possibility, and the future stretched ahead like an endless summer day, warm and welcoming, and full of hope for wonders yet to be discovered. The furtive pygmy, content as always to remain in the shadows while others claimed the glory, watched these developments with the patient wisdom of one who understood that all things must change, that even the mightiest lords were subject to the same forces of time and transformation that governed all existence. In the darkness that he had claimed as his domain, new forms of life were stirring, new possibilities taking shape that would one day challenge everything the Age of Fire had established. But that time was still distant, still hidden in the shadows of an unknowable future. For now, there was victory to celebrate, a new world to explore, and the intoxicating promise of an age where light would reign eternal and the grey twilight would never return. The war was over, the dragons defeated, and the future belonged to those who had claimed the power to shape it according to their will and vision. When the great war against the ancient dragons finally drew to its close and the last of the stone worms fell beneath the combined might of gods and mortals, Lord Gwyn found himself in the unfamiliar position of a victorious commander who must now become a peacetime ruler. The battlefield strategies that had served him so well in the campaign against the dragons were of little use in the more delicate work of governing a world that had been fundamentally transformed by fire and light. The Age of Fire had begun not with fanfare and celebration, but with the quiet, patient work of building something new from the ashes of the old world. Where once there had been only grey stone and eternal twilight, now there were communities of mortals and immortals learning to live together, cities rising from the bedrock, and the first tentative experiments in the arts of civilization that the grey world had never known. Yet for all the wonder and possibility that surrounded him, Gwyn understood that victory in war created obligations that were no less binding than the duties of battle itself. Those who had fought beside him, who had shed their blood and risked their lives in service to his cause, deserved recognition and reward for their sacrifices. The custom of bestowing gifts upon one's allies was as old as conflict itself. But in this new age of gods and miracles, such gifts could take forms that would have been unimaginable in simpler times. To Seath the Scaleless, the pale dragon who had betrayed his own kind to fight alongside the lords, Gwyn granted perhaps the most extraordinary honor that any being had ever received. The treacherous worm was not merely pardoned for his rebellion against his draconic brethren, but was elevated to a position that placed him among the highest nobility of the new age. Dukedom was bestowed upon him, along with all the rights and privileges that such a title carried, transforming him from an outcast dragon into one of the most powerful figures in the emerging kingdom. More than mere political position, Gwyn shared with Seath a fragment of his own great soul, a gift so profound that it fundamentally altered the nature of the recipient. This was not simply a transfer of power, but a form of adoption that made the pale dragon a part of the royal family itself, bound by ties that transcended mere political alliance and entered the realm of the mystical and eternal. The Duke's obsession with the secrets of immortality and the nature of souls would drive him to heights of scholarly achievement that had never been reached before, his crystal caves becoming centers of learning where the fundamental mysteries of existence were explored with a dedication that bordered on madness. Yet his contributions to the advancement of knowledge, however twisted they might eventually become, were rooted in the gratitude and trust that Gwyn had shown him in those early days of the New Age. To the 4 kings of New Londo, those mortal rulers whose wisdom and foresight had made them valuable allies in the war against the dragons, Gwyn granted fragments of his great soul as well, though in smaller portions that reflected their more limited capacity to contain such divine essence. These kings had demonstrated the rare combination of intelligence and ambition that made them worthy of trust, their ability to see beyond immediate concerns to the broader patterns of cause and effect that would shape the future. The gift of soul fragments transformed New Londo into one of the most prosperous and advanced cities of the early Age of Fire, a place where human ingenuity was enhanced by divine power to create wonders that rivaled even the works of the gods themselves. The 4 kings ruled with wisdom and justice, their enhanced abilities allowing them to govern with a fairness and insight that made their city a model for human civilization throughout the known world. Yet perhaps it was in the very generosity of these gifts that the seeds of future tragedy were planted. For power given so freely could also be corrupted or turned to purposes that its giver had never intended. The soul fragments that were meant to reward loyalty and enhance wisdom would one day become sources of temptation and corruption, their divine nature making them as dangerous as they were beneficial. The furtive pygmy and his descendants presented Gwyn with a more complex challenge than his other allies, for they were numerous where the others were few, humble where the others were mighty, and their contributions to the war had been spread across countless small acts of courage, rather than concentrated in a few decisive moments of heroism. How does one reward an entire race for their service? How does one honor those who had never sought honor for themselves? The solution that Gwyn devised was as elegant as it was ominous, though its true nature would not become clear until generations had passed, and the consequences of his decision had rippled through the centuries like stones cast into still water. The ringed city would be humanity's reward, a place of their own where they could live according to their own customs and desires, free from the oversight and interference of their divine patrons. The site chosen for this great city was both magnificent and remote, positioned at what was then considered the very edge of the world, beyond the reach of casual visitors, and far from the centers of divine authority. Here, the descendants of the furtive pygmy could build their own civilization, experiment with their own forms of government, and explore the mysteries of the dark soul without fear of judgment or interference from those who might not understand their nature. The location itself spoke of both honor and isolation. Perched on cliffs that overlooked vast expanses of empty sea, while behind it stretched leagues of wilderness that few had ever explored. It was a place of breathtaking beauty, where the interplay of light and shadow created vistas that seemed to capture the very essence of the boundary between the Age of Fire and whatever age might follow it. The architecture that rose from the bedrock of this remote realm was unlike anything that had been built before, incorporating both the divine inspiration that characterized the greatest works of the Age of Fire and something distinctly human in its proportions and decoration. The ringed city's builders had learned much from observing the construction techniques used in the gods' own projects, but they had adapted and modified these methods to create something that reflected their own aesthetic sensibilities and practical needs. The city's walls rose in great circles that followed the natural contours of the landscape, their stones fitted together with a precision that spoke of both divine instruction and human craftsmanship. These fortifications were not merely defensive structures, but works of art in their own right, their surfaces carved with intricate patterns that told the story of humanity's journey from the dark caves where their ancestors had first discovered the fragments of the Dark Soul to the mighty city they had built at the Dark Soul, World's Edge. Within these walls, a civilization began to flourish that was uniquely human in character, while still bearing the influence of divine guidance and inspiration. The streets were laid out in patterns that accommodated both the practical needs of commerce and governance and the more esoteric requirements of rituals and ceremonies that honored the Dark Soul and its mysterious properties. Markets and temples, workshops and libraries, all were integrated into a coherent whole that reflected humanity's growing understanding of their place in the cosmic order. The Ring Knights, those champions who had distinguished themselves in the war against the dragons, became the city's protectors and exemplars, their skill with weapons forged in abyssal fires, making them formidable guardians of their people's independence and security. Their armor bore the distinctive patterns that would become synonymous with the ringed city itself, circular motifs that seemed to capture and hold light in ways that ordinary metalwork could never achieve. Each of these knights was a master of combat techniques that had been developed specifically for warfare against the ancient dragons, their weapons and tactics refined through generations of conflict, until they had achieved a perfection that bordered on the supernatural. The dragon heads that adorned their shields and decorated their halls were not mere trophies, but symbols of a heritage that connected them to the very founding moments of the New Age. The forges where their weapons were crafted burned with fires that had been kindled in the depths of the abyss itself, creating arms and armor that possessed properties no conventional smithwork could match. These dark flames could work metals in ways that normal fire could not, imbuing the finished products with qualities that made them as much magical artifacts as practical tools of war. The culture that developed within the ringed city's walls was one that celebrated both individual achievement and collective identity, honoring heroes and champions, while never forgetting that their strength came from their unity as a people. The festivals and ceremonies that marked the passage of seasons and the commemoration of great events were occasions for the entire community to come together, their shared heritage as children of the dark soul creating bonds that transcended the ordinary divisions of class and profession. Yet even in those early days of prosperity and growth, there were signs that all was not as it seemed with Gwyn's generous gift. The city's isolation, which had initially been presented as a blessing that would allow humanity to develop without interference, gradually began to reveal itself as something more ambiguous. Visitors from other realms found the journey to the ringed city increasingly difficult, as if the very paths that led there were shifting and changing to discourage casual travel. The ringed city's inhabitants began to notice that their communications with the outside world were becoming less frequent and less reliable, though the reasons for this isolation were not immediately apparent. Messages sent to allies and trading partners in other kingdoms often went unanswered, while messengers dispatched from the city sometimes failed to return, their fate a mystery that troubled those who had sent them forth. The walls that had been built to protect the city from external threats gradually began to take on a different character, their defensive nature becoming less about keeping enemies out and more about ensuring that the city's inhabitants remained within. The gates that had once stood open to welcome visitors and facilitate trade were now more often closed, their guardians growing increasingly selective about who was permitted to enter or leave. The pygmy lords who ruled the city with wisdom and justice found their authority subtly undermined by influences they could not clearly identify or combat. Decisions that should have been made locally were sometimes overruled by edicts from distant authorities, while policies that served the city's interests were mysteriously reversed without explanation or consultation. The realization that their gift was also a prison came gradually, like the slow dawn of understanding that transforms confusion into bitter clarity. The ringed city had indeed been granted sovereignty, but it was a sovereignty that existed only within carefully defined boundaries that its inhabitants were not permitted to cross. The freedom they had been given was real, but it was the freedom of a bird in a cage, able to fly within the limits of its enclosure, but unable to venture into the wider world beyond. The psychological impact of this discovery was profound and lasting, creating a sense of betrayal that would color humanity's relationship with the divine for generations to come. They had served faithfully in the war against the dragons, had shed their blood and sacrificed their lives for a cause they believed in, only to find themselves rewarded with a gift that was also a sentence of exile from the world they had helped to create. The pygmy lords, who had initially welcomed Gwyn's generosity, now found themselves grappling with the complex emotions of beings who had been both honored and insulted, elevated and diminished, rewarded and punished, all at the same time. Their descendants would inherit not only the benefits of the ringed city's advanced civilization, but also the burden of knowing that their ancestors' greatest achievements had been confined within walls that they had not chosen and could not escape. The dark soul fragments that flowed through the bloodlines of the city's inhabitants began to resonate with these feelings of confinement and betrayal, their natural properties influenced and shaped by the collective emotional state of those who carried them. Where once the dark soul had been associated with growth and change and the infinite potential of humanity, now it began to carry within it echoes of anger and resentment that would grow stronger with each passing generation. The knowledge that they were prisoners rather than honored guests changed everything about how the ringed city's inhabitants viewed their relationship with the divine and their place in the cosmic order. The ceremonies that had once celebrated their unique heritage now carried undertones of defiance and mourning, while the stories passed down through generations began to emphasize themes of endurance and resistance rather than gratitude and cooperation. Yet despite the growing awareness of their true situation, the people of the ringed city did not despair or abandon the civilization they had built. Instead, they adapted to their circumstances with the same resourcefulness and determination that had made their ancestors valuable allies in the war against the dragons. If they were to be prisoners, they would be prisoners who maintained their dignity and their culture, who preserved their knowledge and their traditions for whatever future might await them. The ringed city became a repository of human achievement and wisdom, a place where the arts and sciences were cultivated with an intensity born of the knowledge that they might be the last witnesses to their own greatness. The libraries and schools that rose within the city's walls became centers of learning that rivaled anything in the wider world, their scholars and teachers working with the desperate dedication of those who understand that their work might be all that survives of their civilization. In this atmosphere of proud confinement and dignified resistance, the seeds of future conflict were planted and carefully tended. The ringed city would endure for ages, its walls standing strong against the passage of time and the changing fortunes of the world beyond. But it would do so as a monument to both human achievement and divine betrayal, a reminder that even the most generous gifts can carry within them the seeds of their own contradiction. The great irony of Gwyn's gift to humanity was that in trying to contain the threat he perceived in the dark soul, he had created the very conditions that would ensure its eventual corruption and rebellion. The isolation that was meant to protect the world from humanity's darkness instead concentrated and intensified it, turning what might have been a gentle evolution into something far more dramatic and dangerous. At the very heart of the ringed city, in a chamber so sacred that even the boldest of the pygmy lords approached it only with reverence and trepidation, there lay a mystery that transcended the ordinary understanding of mortals and immortals alike. Here, in a space that seemed to exist at the intersection of dreams and waking reality, Princess Filianore maintained her endless vigil, cradled in slumber, so profound that it appeared to touch the very foundations of existence itself. She was Gwyn's youngest daughter, born in the early days of the Age of Fire when the Lord of Sunlight's power was at its zenith, and his authority seemed as eternal as the light he commanded. Yet unlike her siblings who had inherited positions of obvious power and influence within their father's growing domain, Filianore had been chosen for a role that was both more crucial and more tragic than anything her divine family could have imagined. The princess lay upon a bed that had been crafted from materials that existed nowhere else in the known world, its construction requiring techniques that blended the finest artistry of the gods with mysteries drawn from the deepest wells of ancient knowledge. The chamber that surrounded her was a marvel of architecture that seemed to defy the normal laws of space and proportion, its walls curving away into distances that appeared far greater than the physical structure that contained them should have been able to accommodate. Light filtered into this sacred space through apertures that seemed to exist in dimensions beyond the ordinary three, creating an illumination that was both gentle and otherworldly. Neither the harsh radiance of direct sunlight, nor the comfortable warmth of firelight, but something altogether more subtle and complex. This illumination fell upon the sleeping figure of the princess with a reverence that spoke of forces far greater than mere architectural planning or decorative intent. Filianore herself appeared as a young woman frozen at the very moment of transition from adolescence to full adulthood, her features bearing the delicate perfection that characterized the highest works of divine craftsmanship, while still retaining the softness and vulnerability that marked her as fundamentally different from the terrible grandeur of her more powerful relatives. Her hair fell in waves of gold that seemed to capture and hold the mysterious light that filled her chamber, while her skin possessed the luminous quality of polished marble that had been touched by some blessing beyond mortal understanding. Yet it was not the princess herself, magnificent though she was, that drew the eye and held the attention of those few privileged souls who were permitted to enter her sacred chamber. Cradled against her breast, held with the tender care of a mother protecting her most precious child, was an object that defied easy description or comfortable categorization. An egg of such perfect smoothness and mysterious origin that it seemed to exist as much in the realm of symbol and metaphor as in the physical world of substance and form. The egg was neither large nor small in any absolute sense, but rather possessed the peculiar quality of seeming to change in apparent size depending upon the angle from which it was viewed and the state of mind of the observer. At times it appeared delicate and fragile, no larger than could be comfortably held in cupped hands, while at others it seemed to possess a weight and presence that suggested vastness beyond easy comprehension. Its surface was unmarked by any visible seam or flaw, presenting instead a uniformity of color and texture that spoke of perfection, achieved through means that transcended ordinary craftsmanship. The hue of the egg was difficult to define with precision, shifting subtly between pearl white and pale gold and the faintest suggestion of colors that had no names in any mortal tongue, creating an overall impression of luminous beauty that seemed to glow with its own inner light. The relationship between the sleeping princess and her mysterious burden was clearly one of the most profound intimacy and mutual dependence, as if each could not exist without the other, as if the very concept of separation was not merely practically impossible, but fundamentally meaningless in the context of their shared existence. Filianore's arms encircled the egg with a protectiveness that spoke of purposes far deeper than mere guardianship, while the egg itself seemed to pulse with a life that was somehow synchronized with the princess's own breathing and heartbeat. This synchronization extended beyond the merely physical into realms that touched upon the metaphysical nature of time and existence itself. Scholars who had been permitted to study the sleeping princess from a respectful distance reported that the rhythm of her breathing appeared to correspond with patterns that could be observed throughout the ringed city and beyond, as if her slumber was somehow connected to the fundamental forces that govern the flow of time and the stability of reality. The true nature of this connection remained one of the most closely guarded secrets of the age, known in its entirety only to Gwyn himself, and perhaps to a handful of his most trusted advisors. Yet even those who possessed only fragments of the truth understood that what they witnessed in the princess's chamber was not merely a daughter sleeping, but something far more complex and consequential, a living seal upon forces that must never be allowed to wake, a barrier between the world as it was and possibilities too dangerous to contemplate. The princess's slumber served multiple purposes that were interwoven with such complexity that separating them was like trying to untangle threads in a tapestry without destroying the overall pattern. Most obviously, her sleep protected the dark soul fragments that flowed through the veins of the ringed city's inhabitants, preventing them from achieving their full potential, and thus containing the threat that Gwyn perceived in humanity's unlimited growth and development. Yet this containment was not achieved through crude suppression or violent restraint, but rather through a form of temporal manipulation so subtle and sophisticated that its effects could be felt without its mechanisms being easily understood. The princess's presence seemed to create a bubble of altered time around the ringed city, a space where the normal progression of moments was slowed and modified in ways that prevented the natural evolution and maturation of the dark soul, while allowing life to continue in forms that appeared normal to those who lived within its influence. The egg she cradled served as both the focus and the amplifier for this temporal distortion, its mysterious properties enabling the princess to maintain her influence across vast distances and through the passage of countless years. The relationship between the two was so intimate that it was impossible to say whether the egg drew its power from the princess or whether she derived her abilities from her connection to it, or indeed whether such distinctions had any meaningful application to beings who existed partially outside the normal flow of cause and effect. This temporal manipulation had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate area of the ringed city itself, creating ripple effects that could be felt throughout the known world in ways both subtle and profound. The stability of the Age of Fire itself was partially dependent upon the princess's continued slumber, her dreams serving as a foundation upon which the entire cosmic order of light and shadow, fire and darkness, could maintain its delicate balance. The knowledge of what would happen if the princess were to wake, if the egg were to be disturbed, if the careful equilibrium that her sacrifice maintained were to be disrupted, was perhaps the most terrifying secret that the Age of Fire possessed. The few surviving texts that made reference to such possibilities spoke in terms so oblique and metaphorical that their true meaning could only be guessed at, but the implications they suggested were sufficient to ensure that the princess's chamber was protected with a devotion that bordered on religious fervor. The tragedy of Princess Filianor's situation was not merely personal but cosmic in its scope, for she had been condemned to sacrifice not only her own life and freedom, but her very experience of existence itself, in service to her father's vision of order and stability. Unlike death, which at least offered the promise of rest and release from worldly concerns, her slumber was a state of suspended animation that denied her both the experiences of life and the peace of ending. She would never know the joy of awakening to sunlight streaming through windows, never experience the satisfaction of accomplishment or the comfort of friendship, never taste food or feel the wind on her skin, or hear music or laughter, or any of the countless small pleasures that made existence meaningful for those who were free to live it. Her sacrifice was total and absolute, encompassing not just what she had given up, but what she would never have the opportunity to discover. Yet even in her profound unconsciousness, the princess was not entirely absent from the world she protected through her sacrifice. Those who spent long hours in her presence reported dreams and visions that seemed to carry messages from the sleeping figure, fragments of consciousness that escaped the bounds of her enforced slumber to touch the minds of others, with wisdom and warning, and occasionally with something that might have been sorrow for all that had been lost in the name of necessity. The chamber itself seemed to respond to the presence of visitors, its mysterious illumination growing brighter or dimmer according to some incomprehensible pattern, while the air occasionally stirred with breezes that had no obvious source but carried with them scents of flowers that bloomed nowhere in the waking world. These phenomena were so subtle that they might have been dismissed as imagination by skeptical observers, yet they occurred with sufficient regularity and consistency that even the most rational scholars acknowledged that something beyond normal understanding was taking place. The egg that the princess held so tenderly was the subject of countless theories and speculations among those who were privileged to know of its existence. Some believed it to be a vessel containing the concentrated essence of time itself, while others suggested that it held within it the seed of a new age that would be born when the current cosmic cycle finally reached its end. Still others proposed that the egg was not a container at all, but rather a window or gateway through which the princess could perceive possibilities and futures that remained hidden from ordinary sight. The truth, insofar as it could be determined by mortal investigation, seemed to incorporate elements from all of these theories while transcending the limitations that each of them imposed. The egg was simultaneously a tool and a symbol, a practical device and a metaphysical concept, a thing that existed in the physical world, and a representation of forces that operated according to laws that had little to do with ordinary matter and energy. What was certain was that the relationship between the princess, the egg, and the temporal distortions that surrounded the ringed city was not accidental or temporary, but had been deliberately designed to function as a self-sustaining system that could maintain its operation indefinitely. The princess's slumber fed power into the egg, which channeled and focused that power to maintain the temporal bubble, which in turn preserved the conditions necessary for the princess to continue sleeping undisturbed. This cyclical arrangement was both elegant and terrifying in its implications, for it suggested that Filianor's sacrifice was intended to be truly eternal, lasting not merely for the duration of the current age, but for as long as reality itself persisted. She had been transformed from a living being with her own desires and aspirations into a component in a vast machine designed to preserve a particular vision of cosmic order. Her identity subsumed into a function that served purposes far beyond anything she could have chosen for herself. The moral implications of this arrangement were staggering in their complexity and troubling in their conclusions. Even if one accepted that the preservation of cosmic stability justified extreme measures, the use of an unwilling family member as a permanent sacrifice raised questions about the nature of authority and the limits of acceptable action that had no comfortable answers. Gwyn's decision to condemn his own daughter to eternal unconsciousness in service to his fears about the future revealed depths of ruthlessness and desperation that cast everything else he had accomplished in a very different light. Yet it was also possible to interpret the princess's situation as the ultimate expression of divine love and sacrifice, a willing acceptance of an unbearable burden, for the sake of protecting not only her own family, but all of existence from threats that ordinary minds could not fully comprehend. The absence of any record, suggesting that Filianor had protested or resisted her fate, might indicate that she had understood and accepted the necessity of her role, choosing conscious sacrifice over unconscious destruction. The truth of what had transpired in those ancient days when the decision was made and the princess first closed her eyes in that sacred chamber would remain forever hidden behind veils of time and discretion, accessible only to those who had been present at the moment of transformation and who had taken their knowledge with them into whatever realms awaited beings of divine nature when their roles in mortal affairs finally came to an end. What remained was the fact of her slumber and its consequences, a reality that shaped the destiny of countless souls who would never know her name or understand the magnitude of what she had given up for their sake. The very existence of Princess Filianor's chamber at the heart of the ringed city served as a reminder that the apparently generous gift of sovereignty that humanity had received was built upon a foundation of deception and control that reached to the very highest levels of divine authority. The prison that confined humanity was not merely physical walls and isolation from the wider world, but something far more fundamental, a manipulation of time itself that prevented them from achieving their full potential while maintaining the illusion that they were free to develop according to their own nature and desires. Among all the figures who moved through the corridors and chambers of the ringed city during its long and troubled history, none embodied the complex contradictions of divine authority and mortal suffering quite like Shira, a woman whose very existence served as a living bridge between the age of gods and the twilight of their power. She carried within her bloodline the essence of divinity itself, yet chose to spend her days in the deepest and darkest chambers of humanity's prison, watching over secrets that could never be shared and bearing burdens that could never be set down. Her titles alone told a story that spanned the entirety of the Age of Fire and reached back into the primordial conflicts that had shaped the world itself. Daughter of the Duke, she bore the noble blood of Seath the Scaleless, that pale dragon who had betrayed his own kind to fight alongside Lord Gwyn in the great war against the ancient dragons. Descendant of the gods, her heritage connected her directly to the divine lineages that had ruled the world since the first flames had banished the grey twilight of the Age of Ancients. As matriarch of the Church, she held ecclesiastical authority that transcended the boundaries between mortal and immortal realms. Her word, carrying the weight of divine sanction in matters both temporal and spiritual. Her friendship with Medea, the great dragon who had been raised by the gods themselves to serve as eternal guardian of the ringed city, marked her as one of the few beings who could communicate with and understand creatures whose nature existed beyond the normal categories of mortal comprehension. Yet it was perhaps her role as dragon-slaying knightess that revealed the most about her character and the choices that had defined her long existence. Unlike many who claim such titles through inherited privilege or political appointment, Shira had earned her reputation through deeds of valor that had been witnessed by gods and mortals alike. Her skill with the cross spear, making her one of the most formidable warriors of any age or realm. The cross spear itself was a weapon of such distinctive design and deadly purpose that its very appearance on any battlefield was sufficient to strike fear into the hearts of dragons and inspire hope in those who fought against the ancient enemies of civilization. Forged specifically for combat against the great worms whose scale and breath had once made them seem invincible, the crossspear incorporated design principles that transcended ordinary weapon crafting and entered the realm of divine engineering. Its head was shaped in the form of a cross, each of the 4 arms terminating in a point so sharp and perfectly balanced that it could penetrate even the legendary scales of the ancient dragons, while its shaft was inscribed with symbols and patterns that channeled the wielder's strength and intent into forms of energy that could wound creatures immune to conventional attacks. The weapon was not merely a tool for battle, but a work of art that embodied the highest aspirations of those who had dedicated their lives to protecting the innocent from predators too mighty for ordinary mortals to face. As handmaiden to Princess Filianore, Shira had been granted access to secrets that were hidden even from most of the gods themselves. Her loyalty and discretion, making her one of the few beings trusted with knowledge of the true nature of the princess's eternal slumber and the cosmic forces that it held in check. This privilege came with responsibilities that would have crushed lesser souls, for to know the truth of what hung in the balance was to understand that any failure or moment of inattention could result in consequences beyond imagination. Her vigil in the dark room represented the ultimate expression of duty carried to its logical conclusion, a commitment so absolute that it transcended the normal boundaries between service and sacrifice, between devotion and self-destruction. The chamber where she had chosen to imprison herself was perhaps the most somber and forbidding location in all the ringed city, a place where even the boldest of the pygmy lords feared to venture without compelling cause. The dark room existed in a state of perpetual twilight that seemed to absorb light rather than merely excluding it. Its walls, constructed from stones that had been quarried in the deepest levels of the city's foundations and shaped by techniques that predated the arrival of divine influence in human affairs. The very air in this chamber carried a weight and density that made breathing an effort, as if the atmosphere itself had been concentrated and compressed by forces that operated according to principles beyond normal understanding. At the center of this oppressive space, mounted upon a pedestal that had been carved from a single block of black stone, whose surface seemed to drink in what little illumination managed to penetrate the chamber's gloom, lay the corpse of a being whose death had shaped the destiny of the ringed city in ways that few of its inhabitants fully comprehended. This was the body of a pygmy king, one of the royal lineage that had ruled humanity's prison kingdom since its founding, whose madness had threatened to bring catastrophe upon everything his ancestors had built. The king's madness had not been the simple insanity of a mind broken by stress or trauma, but something far more complex and dangerous. A corruption of the dark soul itself that had manifested in ways that challenged the fundamental assumptions about the nature of humanity and its relationship to the cosmic forces that governed existence. Where the dark soul was meant to be a source of growth and change and infinite potential, in this unfortunate monarch it had become something twisted and destructive, a force that sought to tear down rather than build up, to destroy rather than create. The specific nature of his madness remained one of the most closely guarded secrets of the ringed city's history, known in its entirety only to Shira herself, and perhaps to a handful of ancient texts that were locked away in vaults so secure that their very existence was doubted by most scholars. What was known was that his condition had posed a threat, not merely to the stability of his own kingdom, but to the delicate balance of forces that kept the entire Age of Fire from collapsing into chaos. The decision to end the Mad King's life had not been made lightly or in haste, but only after every other possible solution had been explored and found wanting. The greatest healers and sages of the age had examined the afflicted monarch, seeking some cure for his condition or some means of containing its effects without resorting to the ultimate sanction. Yet the corruption that had claimed his soul proved resistant to every form of treatment or intervention, growing stronger with each passing day, until it became clear that decisive action could no longer be delayed. Shira's role in the king's death had been both martial and merciful, her cross spear serving as the instrument through which the suffering monarch was finally granted the release that his condition would never have allowed him to find through natural means. Yet the weapon that had been designed to kill dragons proved inadequate to the task of permanently ending the existence of one who carried the dark soul within his very essence. The cross spear, for all its divine craftsmanship and legendary effectiveness against the ancient dragons, had been created according to principles that assumed its targets would be creatures of fundamentally different nature from those who wielded it. Dragons, no matter how mighty or magical, were still beings of flesh and scale and bone, susceptible to weapons that could breach their defenses and reach the vital organs that sustained their existence. A pygmy king, however, was something altogether different. A being whose life force was intimately connected to powers that transcended the physical realm and operated according to laws that had little to do with ordinary biology or anatomy. The dark soul that flowed through his veins was not merely an enhancement to his natural abilities, but the very foundation of his existence, the source from which his consciousness and identity drew their strength and continuity. When Shira's cross spear pierced the Mad King's heart and should have brought his tormented existence to a merciful end, it instead created a situation that neither she nor any of her advisors had anticipated. The weapon, designed to kill through the severing of physical connections and the disruption of natural processes, found itself confronted with a target whose essential nature could not be destroyed through conventional means. The result was a form of eternal impalement that bound both weapon and victim in a relationship that neither could escape through any effort of will or application of power. The cross spear had become lodged, not merely in the king's physical form, but in the very essence of his being, creating a connection between steel and soul that transcended the normal boundaries between the material and spiritual realms. The Mad King could not die because the weapon that had been meant to kill him was not capable of severing his connection to the dark soul, while the cross spear could not be withdrawn because it had become entangled with forces that operated according to principles its creators had never needed to consider. The two had become locked together in a stalemate that could only be maintained through constant vigilance and absolute dedication. Recognizing that this situation required a form of guardianship that could match its own eternal nature, Shira made the decision that would define the remainder of her existence. Rather than seeking some means of escaping the consequences of what had occurred, she chose to embrace them fully, accepting responsibility not only for the immediate effects of her actions, but for all the implications and ramifications that would flow from them across the ages to come. Her self-imposed imprisonment in the dark room was not merely a matter of physical confinement, but a complete surrender of personal freedom and individual desire in service to a duty that demanded nothing less than the total sacrifice of everything that might have made her own existence meaningful or pleasant. She could never again walk in sunlight or feel the wind on her face or enjoy the company of friends, for to leave the chamber even for a moment would risk allowing the Mad King's influence to spread beyond the bounds that her presence helped to maintain. The relationship between Shira and the corpse she guarded was one of the most profound intimacy and mutual dependence, though it was an intimacy born of necessity rather than affection, and a dependence that neither party had chosen or desired. She could feel the Mad King's presence as a constant weight upon her consciousness, his twisted thoughts and corrupted desires pressing against the barriers of her own sanity. Like a poison, seeking to find some crack or weakness through which it could spread. Yet at the same time, her presence served as an anchor that prevented the king's madness from achieving complete dominion over the dark soul fragment that sustained his existence. Her own stability and clarity of purpose created a counterbalance to his corruption, maintaining a delicate equilibrium that kept his influence contained within the boundaries of the dark room, while preventing it from affecting the rest of the ringed city. This constant struggle between order and chaos, sanity and madness, control and corruption, took place not on any battlefield that ordinary eyes could perceive, but in dimensions of existence that touched upon the fundamental nature of consciousness itself. Shira's mind became the arena where these forces met and clashed, her thoughts and memories and dreams serving as the territory over which the battle for the king's soul was fought day after day and year after year. The psychological toll of this endless conflict was beyond anything that mortal minds were designed to endure. Yet Shira's divine heritage provided her with resources and capabilities that allowed her to maintain her essential identity even under pressures that would have shattered lesser beings within days or weeks of exposure. Her connection to the lineage of gods gave her access to forms of strength and endurance that operated according to principles very different from those that governed ordinary human resilience. Yet even divine strength had its limits, and over the long centuries of her vigil, subtle changes began to manifest in Shira's appearance and behavior that spoke of the tremendous cost her sacrifice was exacting from her very essence. Her movements became more deliberate and careful, as if each gesture required conscious thought and planning, rather than flowing naturally from intention to action. Her speech grew more measured and precise, the words chosen with the care of someone who understood that every utterance carried weight and consequence beyond its immediate meaning. Most telling of all were the changes in her eyes, which had once burned with the fierce light of divine purpose, but now reflected depths of weariness and sorrow that spoke of burdens too great for any single soul to bear. Yet within those depths there remained an unshakable core of determination and commitment that testified to her refusal to abandon her post, no matter what personal cost might be required. The friendship that had developed between Shira and Midir over the long ages of their parallel service represented one of the few sources of comfort and companionship available to either of these dedicated guardians. Both had accepted roles that required them to sacrifice their own desires and ambitions in service to duties that would never end. Both understood the weight of responsibility that came with protecting forces and secrets that could reshape or destroy the world if they were ever allowed to escape proper containment. Their conversations, conducted across the barriers that separated the dark room from the outer chambers of the ringed city, touched upon topics and concerns that neither could share with any other being. They spoke of the loneliness that came with eternal service, of the gradual erosion of personal identity that resulted from subsuming individual needs into collective responsibilities, and of the strange comfort that could be found in the knowledge that their sacrifices served purposes greater than themselves. Midir's own struggle against the corruption of the Abyss provided him with insights into Shira's battle against the Mad King's influence, while her experience with containing and controlling forces that sought to escape proper boundaries gave her understanding of the challenges he faced in his role as guardian of the sleeping princess. Together, they formed a bond that transcended the normal categories of friendship or alliance and entered the realm of shared purpose and mutual recognition. Yet even this relationship, precious as it was to both participants, was shaped and limited by the constraints of their respective duties. They could offer each other understanding and support, but they could not provide the kind of relief or assistance that would allow either to escape the burdens they had accepted. Their friendship was a source of strength, but it was also a reminder of all that they had given up in service to purposes that demanded everything and offered little in return beyond the knowledge that their sacrifices mattered. The tragedy of Shira's situation was not merely personal, but representative of the broader contradictions that lay at the heart of the Age of Fire itself. She was a being of divine heritage who had chosen to spend her existence in the darkest corner of humanity's prison. A warrior whose greatest victory had created a burden that could never be set down. A guardian whose devotion had transformed her from a free agent into a living component of the cosmic machinery that kept the world from collapsing into chaos. Her story served as a reminder that the stability and order that characterized the Age of Fire had been purchased at costs that were rarely acknowledged or fully understood, that the peace and prosperity enjoyed by countless souls throughout the realms had been built upon foundations of sacrifice and suffering that touched the very highest levels of divine society. In protecting the world from the Mad King's corruption, Shira had become both hero and victim, savior and prisoner, her nobility measured not in the glory she had won, but in the freedom she had surrendered for the sake of others, who would never know her name or understand the magnitude of what she had given up for their benefit. In the shadowed halls where ancient stone met divine purpose, there existed a covenant unlike any other that had been forged in the long history of the Age of Fire. The spears of the church stood as the final guardians of Princess Filianor, their sacred duty transcending the ordinary bonds of military service or political allegiance to become something approaching religious devotion. These warriors had dedicated their lives not to conquest or glory, but to the preservation of a slumber so profound that the very foundations of reality depended upon its continuation. At the heart of this sacred brotherhood stood Argo, a figure whose presence commanded respect and reverence from even the most battle-hardened warriors who had earned the right to stand among the spears. His voice carried the weight of absolute authority when he spoke the ancient words of challenge to those who would disturb the princess's rest, each syllable resonating with power that seemed to draw its strength from sources far deeper than mere mortal conviction. The ritual phrases that Argo intoned were not merely ceremonial warnings, but incantations that had been carefully crafted to channel the protective forces that surrounded the ringed city itself. When he declared that unknown visitors must return from whence they came, his words carried with them the accumulated power of countless prayers and invocations that had been offered up by generations of faithful servants. The warning that the abyss ran deep was not simply a statement of geographical fact, but a recognition of the cosmic forces that lay beneath the surface of apparent reality, while the invocation of the king's decree served to remind all who heard it that the authority protecting the princess extended to the very highest levels of divine power. The covenant that bound the spears together was forged from elements that transcended the ordinary understanding of military organization or religious order. Each member had voluntarily surrendered not merely their freedom of movement or their personal ambitions, but their very identity as individual agents in the world, choosing instead to become living extensions of a collective will that existed solely to serve the needs of their slumbering charge. This transformation from independent warrior to sacred guardian was not accomplished through simple oath-taking or ceremonial ritual, but required a fundamental alteration of consciousness that touched upon the deepest mysteries of divine service. The process by which ordinary mortals could be elevated to this exalted state remained one of the most closely guarded secrets of the ringed city, known in its entirety only to those who had undergone the transformation themselves, and to the ancient powers who had first established the covenant in the early days of the city's founding. What was known was that the honor of becoming a spear of the church was granted only to those who had demonstrated not merely exceptional skill in combat or unwavering loyalty to the cause, but a particular quality of spiritual readiness that marked them as capable of sustaining the psychological and metaphysical pressures that came with their sacred role. The selection process was so rigorous and the requirements so demanding that entire generations might pass without producing a single candidate deemed worthy of admission to their ranks. Among all those who had been granted this supreme honor, none embodied the contradictions and complexities of divine service quite like Half-Light, a figure whose very presence among the spears served as a reminder that the most profound dedication could arise from the most unexpected circumstances. His origins lay not in the military traditions of the Ringed City or in the ancient bloodlines that had served the gods since the beginning of the Age of Fire, but in the scholarly pursuits and humanitarian missions that had characterized the golden age of Ulasil. Ulasil itself had been one of the great centers of learning and enlightenment in the early centuries of the Age of Fire, a realm where the arts of light sorcery had been refined to levels of sophistication that rivaled even the works of the gods themselves. The city's scholars and mages had dedicated themselves to the pursuit of knowledge that could benefit all of creation. Their research and experimentation, guided by principles of wisdom and restraint, that had allowed them to explore even the most dangerous subjects without falling victim to the corruption that had claimed so many other centers of learning. The relationship between Ulasil and the Ringed City represented one of the few genuine alliances that humanity's prison kingdom had been permitted to maintain with the outside world. This connection was founded not upon political convenience or military necessity, but upon a shared recognition of the cosmic forces that shaped the destiny of all mortal beings and the responsibility that came with possessing knowledge of such profound and dangerous matters. The missionaries that Ulasil sent forth to distant realms carried with them not merely religious teachings or philosophical insights, but practical knowledge that could help communities develop the wisdom and spiritual strength necessary to resist the corrupting influences that threatened all who lived in an age when the boundaries between light and shadow, order and chaos were constantly shifting and uncertain. These dedicated souls understood that their work was not merely academic or theoretical, but touched upon matters of ultimate consequence for the survival of civilization itself. Half-Light had been among the most devoted and capable of these missionaries, his combination of scholarly knowledge and practical wisdom, making him an ideal ambassador for the principles and values that Ulasil represented. His journeys had taken him to the farthest corners of the known world, where he had witnessed firsthand both the wonders that divine power could accomplish when properly directed, and the horrors that resulted when such power was corrupted or misused. The white birch bow that he carried was more than a simple weapon or even a symbol of his origins, but a relic that embodied the highest achievements of Ulasil's magical research and craftsmanship. The bow had been crafted from wood taken from trees that grew in groves touched by divine light, their fibers imbued with properties that allowed them to channel and focus the energies of light sorcery with a precision and efficiency that ordinary materials could never achieve. The arrows that could be loosed from this magnificent weapon were not merely projectiles but concentrated expressions of the archer's will and purpose, capable of striking targets that existed partially outside the normal dimensions of space and time, while carrying with them the purifying influence of light magic that could cleanse corruption and heal wounds that ordinary medicine could never touch. In the hands of a master like Half-Light, the white birch bow became an instrument of such deadly effectiveness that even the most fearsome enemies of light and order had learned to fear its distinctive whisper as it sent its sacred missiles flying toward their targets. Yet it was not the power of his weapon or the extent of his scholarly knowledge that had qualified Half-Light for admission to the ranks of the Spears of the Church, but rather the quality of dedication that had led him to make the most profound sacrifice that any mortal could offer. When his missionary journey had brought him to the gates of the Ringed City, and he had been granted the rare privilege of witnessing the truth of Princess Filianor's situation, he had been faced with a choice that would define not merely the remainder of his own existence, but his place in the cosmic order itself. The decision to remain in the Ringed City and dedicate his life to the protection of the sleeping princess had not been made in a moment of emotional impulse or religious fervor, but after careful consideration of all that such a commitment would entail. Half-Light understood that accepting the honor of becoming a Spear of the Church meant abandoning forever any possibility of returning to his homeland, of continuing his scholarly pursuits, of maintaining the relationships and connections that had previously given meaning and structure to his existence. He would never again walk the familiar paths of Ulasil or participate in the great debates and discussions that had shaped his intellectual development. The libraries and laboratories where he had spent countless hours in research and experimentation would continue their work without his contributions, while the communities he had served as a missionary would need to find other sources of guidance and support. His very identity as a scholar and teacher would be subsumed into his new role as guardian and protector, his individual achievements forgotten in favor of the collective purpose that now defined his existence. Yet for Half-Light, these sacrifices were not sources of regret or sorrow, but opportunities to participate in something greater and more meaningful than anything he could have accomplished through his individual efforts alone. The knowledge that his vigilance helped to maintain the delicate balance of forces that kept the world from descending into chaos gave weight and purpose to every moment of his new existence, transforming what might have been seen as imprisonment into a form of sacred service that transcended ordinary understanding. The alliance between Ulasil and the Ringed City that had made Half-Light's mission possible represented one of the few instances in the history of the Age of Fire where different realms had been able to cooperate on the basis of genuine mutual respect and shared understanding rather than political necessity or military expedience. Both cities had recognized that the challenges facing their world required responses that went beyond the capabilities of any single community or tradition, that the preservation of wisdom and the protection of cosmic order demanded a form of collaboration that transcended the boundaries of individual sovereignty. This cooperation had manifested not merely in the exchange of scholars and missionaries, but in the sharing of knowledge and resources that had allowed both realms to develop capabilities and insights that neither could have achieved in isolation. Ulasail's mastery of light sorcery had provided the Ringed City with tools and techniques for containing and controlling the dark forces that were an inevitable part of their existence, while the Ringed City's deep understanding of the Dark Soul and its properties had given Ulasail's scholars insights into the fundamental nature of reality that had enhanced their own research and experimentation. The white birch bow that Half-Light carried served as a tangible symbol of this alliance, its presence in the Ringed City serving as a reminder that even in their isolation, humanity's prison kingdom maintained connections to the wider world and the noble traditions that had shaped the development of civilization throughout the Age of Fire. The weapon represented not merely the military might that could be brought to bear in defense of the princess, but the intellectual and spiritual resources that both realms had dedicated to the preservation of cosmic order. The honor that Shira, as descendant of the gods and friend to Medea, showed to those who achieved the rank of Divine Spear represented recognition of a transformation that few mortals could hope to undergo successfully. The title itself carried connotations that reached back to the earliest days of the Age of Fire, when the boundaries between mortal and divine were less clearly defined, and exceptional individuals could earn positions that placed them among the servants of the gods themselves. To become a Divine Spear was to be acknowledged as someone who had transcended the ordinary limitations of mortal existence, not through the accumulation of power or the achievement of political position, but through the depth of dedication and the purity of purpose that marked them as worthy of serving in the most sacred of all roles. The rarity of such recognition in the current age spoke to the exceptional nature of the calling and the extraordinary demands that it placed upon those who accepted it. Shira's own position as friend to Medea and guardian of the mad pygmy king gave her a unique perspective on the nature of service and sacrifice that made her recognition of the Divine Spears particularly meaningful. She understood from personal experience the psychological and spiritual costs that came with accepting responsibilities that could never be set aside, the gradual erosion of personal identity that resulted from dedicating one's entire existence to purposes greater than individual desire or ambition. Her acknowledgement of the honor that had been bestowed upon those who achieved the rank of Divine Spear carried with it not merely formal recognition of their status, but genuine appreciation for the magnitude of what they had chosen to sacrifice. In a world where most beings, even those of noble character and good intentions, retained some measure of personal freedom and individual agency, the Spears had voluntarily surrendered even these most basic aspects of autonomous existence in service to a cause that demanded everything and offered little in return beyond the knowledge that their dedication served the highest possible purpose. The friendship that existed between Shira and those who served as Spears of the Church was built upon a foundation of shared understanding that transcended the ordinary bonds of professional collaboration or mutual respect. They were united not merely by common purpose, but by the recognition that they had all made choices that placed them outside the normal categories of mortal existence, that they had all accepted transformations that could never be undone or reversed regardless of what personal costs might eventually be demanded of them. This bond created a form of community that existed despite the physical separation that their respective duties imposed upon them. Though Shira remained confined to the dark room and the Spears maintained their vigil in other parts of the Ringed City, they were connected by invisible threads of mutual recognition and shared commitment that made them part of a brotherhood that transcended the limitations of ordinary social organization. The conversations that occasionally passed between them, transmitted through the mysterious channels that connected all parts of the ringed city's spiritual infrastructure, touched upon subjects and concerns that could not be shared with any other beings. They spoke of the loneliness that came with eternal service, of the strange peace that could be found in surrendering personal will to collective purpose, and of the profound satisfaction that came from knowing that their sacrifices protected things too precious to be left unguarded. Yet even within this community of dedicated souls, each member faced challenges and struggles that were uniquely their own, shaped by the particular nature of their service and the specific demands of their assigned role. The burden that Half-Light carried as bearer of the white birch bow was different from that which fell upon other spears, just as Shira's vigil over the mad pygmy king imposed demands that no other guardian could fully understand. The weapon that Half-Light wielded connected him not merely to his origins in Ulasil, but to a tradition of scholarship and research that had shaped his entire approach to the world and his place within it. Unlike other spears whose service was defined primarily through martial prowess or spiritual dedication, his role required him to maintain the intellectual and analytical capabilities that had made him an effective missionary, adapting these skills to the very different challenges of protecting the sleeping princess. The white birch bow demanded not merely physical skill in its use, but a deep understanding of the principles that govern the interaction between light and shadow, order and chaos, creation and destruction. Each arrow that Half-Light loosed required him to make complex calculations about the nature of the threat he faced, the appropriate level of force to employ, and the potential consequences of his actions for the delicate balance of forces that surrounded the ringed city. This intellectual dimension of his service set him apart from his fellow spears, while simultaneously connecting him to the broader tradition of scholarly inquiry that had always been central to humanity's efforts to understand and master the forces that shaped their existence. In protecting Princess Filianore, Half-Light was not merely serving as a guard or warrior, but as a scholar protector whose vigilance was informed by deep knowledge of the cosmic principles that made such protection necessary. The presence of the white birch bow within the ringed city served as a constant reminder that even in their isolation, the descendants of the furtive pygmy maintained connections to the wider world of learning and enlightenment that had characterized the best aspects of the Age of Fire. The weapon represented hope that the knowledge and wisdom accumulated over generations of scholarly inquiry would not be lost, that the traditions of careful research and thoughtful analysis would survive, even if the institutions that had nurtured them eventually fell to time and circumstance. In this way, Half-Light's service as a spear of the Church encompassed not merely the immediate task of protecting the princess, but the larger responsibility of preserving intellectual and spiritual traditions that represented some of the highest achievements of mortal civilization. His dedication ensured that when the time finally came for these traditions to be passed on to new generations, they would survive in forms that maintained their essential integrity and purpose. In the depths beneath the ringed city, where the ancient foundations gave way to caverns that had never known the touch of sunlight or the blessing of divine flame, there existed a realm that challenged every assumption about the nature of darkness and its relationship to the forces that governed mortal existence. The abyssal swamp stretched through subterranean spaces that seemed to exist partially outside the normal dimensions of reality, its boundaries shifting and uncertain, its depths concealing mysteries that had been growing and changing since the very first moments when the dark soul had been divided among the children of the furtive pygmy. This was not merely a place of shadow and concealment, but a realm where the fundamental nature of humanity's essence could be observed in forms that were both pure and terrifying in their implications. Here, The dark soul existed not as the carefully controlled and contained force that the surface world knew, but as something wild and primal that followed patterns of growth and development that had never been subject to the modifications and restrictions that Gwyn's fear had imposed upon it. The waters of the swamp, if they could truly be called waters, moved with a viscosity and darkness that suggested depths far greater than any normal body of liquid could contain. They seemed to absorb light rather than merely reflecting it, creating pools of absolute blackness that gave no hint of what might lie beneath their surface. Yet these were not still waters, for they moved with currents that followed no earthly logic, their flow driven by forces that had more to do with the ebb and tide of human emotion and desire than with any physical laws of gravity or pressure. From these dark depths rose creatures that embodied the contradictions and complexities that lay at the heart of humanity's relationship with its own essential nature. The locust preachers emerged from the swamp's embrace like living sermons given form, their appearance both fascinating and disturbing to any who encountered them in the shadowed corridors, where they conducted their mysterious gatherings. These beings possessed a form that seemed to shift between the purely spiritual and the grotesquely physical, their bodies combining elements that spoke of both transcendence and decay, wisdom and corruption, hope and despair. Their voices carried the cadence and authority of those who had spent eons contemplating the deepest mysteries of existence, yet the words they spoke challenged every comfortable assumption about the nature of good and evil, light and shadow, salvation and damnation. The sermons of the locust preachers were not merely religious discourse or philosophical speculation, but attempts to communicate truths that had been hidden from the surface world since the earliest days of the Age of Fire. They spoke of the dark soul not as the corrupting influence that Gwyn had feared and sought to contain, but as the natural state of humanity, the force that had been meant to guide mortal development through stages of growth and evolution that the current cosmic order had made impossible to achieve. Their words carried implications that were simultaneously liberating and terrifying, suggesting that everything the Age of Fire had accomplished in terms of order and stability had been built upon a fundamental misunderstanding of the forces that truly governed existence. They preached of a darkness that was gentle and nurturing, rather than destructive and consuming, of an abyss that offered not annihilation, but transformation into forms of being that transcended the limitations and sorrows of mortal existence. Yet the very fact that these sermons were delivered by creatures whose appearance suggested corruption and decay created a profound ambiguity about their message and their motives. Were the locust preachers the bearers of suppressed truths that could free humanity from the constraints that had been imposed upon them by fearful gods, or were they agents of seduction whose beautiful words concealed intentions as dark and twisted as their physical forms suggested? The question of their trustworthiness became one of the most crucial and challenging dilemmas facing any who ventured into the depths of the ringed city and encountered their teachings. The preachers claimed to have existed since the very beginning of the Age of Fire, to have witnessed the first moments when the dark soul was divided and shared among the children of the furtive pygmy. If their claims were true, then their testimony carried the weight of eyewitness accounts of events that had shaped the destiny of all subsequent history. They spoke of a time when humanity's relationship with darkness had been one of harmony and mutual enrichment rather than fear and suppression, when the growth and development that the dark soul enabled had been seen as a blessing rather than a threat. According to their teachings, the problems that had come to be associated with the abyss were not inherent to darkness itself, but were the result of the artificial constraints and modifications that had been imposed upon humanity's natural development. The dark sign that marked every human being as cursed and condemned to eventual hollowing was, in the preacher's interpretation, not a natural aspect of mortal existence, but a brand that had been deliberately applied by Gwyn to prevent humanity from achieving its full potential. This mark of fire surrounding and containing the darkness within each human soul created a constant state of internal conflict, as the natural drive toward growth and change was perpetually opposed by forces that sought to maintain stasis and prevent evolution. This interpretation of the dark side's nature carried profound implications for understanding not only the curse of undeath that plagued humanity throughout the Age of Fire, but also the broader question of whether the cosmic order that Gwyn had established was truly beneficial, or merely the imposition of one being's fears and prejudices upon the entire structure of reality. If the Locust Preachers spoke truly, then the suffering and limitation that defined human existence were not inevitable aspects of mortal nature, but artificial constructions that could theoretically be removed or transcended. Yet the physical appearance of the preachers themselves seemed to contradict their message of gentle darkness and benevolent transformation. Their bodies showed signs of corruption and decay that suggested exposure to forces that were anything but nurturing or beneficial, while their behavior often exhibited the kind of obsessive focus and disturbing intensity that characterized beings whose minds had been affected by prolonged contact with powers beyond normal comprehension. The locust-like qualities that gave them their name were particularly troubling, evoking associations with swarms of insects that consumed everything in their path, leaving behind only devastation and emptiness. Their sermons, for all their philosophical sophistication and apparent wisdom, carried within them an undertone of hunger and desire that suggested motivations far more complex and potentially dangerous than simple educational intent. The question of whether their teachings represented suppressed truth or seductive falsehood became even more complicated when considered in the context of their own apparent origins and development. If they had indeed existed since the beginning of the Age of Fire, then their current state suggested that prolonged exposure to the pure dark soul had effects that were far from the gentle transformation they preached about. Their corruption and decay spoke of forces that consumed and destroyed rather than nurtured and enhanced. Yet, it was also possible that their condition was itself the result of the same artificial constraints and modifications that they claimed had corrupted humanity's relationship with darkness. Perhaps what appeared to be natural corruption was actually the consequence of existing in a world where the dark soul had been forced to operate according to principles that were fundamentally opposed to its nature, creating distortions and perversions that would not have occurred under more natural circumstances. The deeper philosophical question that their existence raised was whether any source of information about the nature of darkness could be trusted, given that all potential witnesses had been shaped and influenced by the very forces they claimed to understand. The Locust Preachers had been exposed to pure darkness for eons, but this exposure had taken place within a cosmic framework established by Gwyn's modifications and constraints. Their perspective, however ancient and extensive, was still filtered through experiences that had occurred under conditions that might have fundamentally altered the nature of what they observed. The sermons themselves were masterpieces of persuasive rhetoric that combined genuine insights into the nature of existence with appeals to emotions and desires that operated below the level of rational analysis. They spoke to the deep longing that existed within every human soul, for freedom from the constraints and limitations that defined mortal existence, offering hope of transcendence and transformation that addressed the most fundamental anxieties and aspirations of conscious beings. Their message that fear of the dark was itself the source of darkness's apparent malevolence was particularly compelling, suggesting that the very efforts to contain and control the dark soul had created the problems that were then used to justify further containment and control. This created a self-perpetuating cycle where fear generated the very threats it sought to prevent, making it impossible to distinguish between natural characteristics and artificial distortions. The theological implications of their teachings challenged not merely specific policies or decisions made by Gwyn and his followers, but the entire conceptual framework upon which the Age of Fire had been constructed. If darkness was indeed the natural state from which light emerged, rather than the corruption that threatened to destroy light's achievements, then the fundamental assumptions about progress, development, and the direction of cosmic evolution needed to be completely reconsidered. Yet even as their words offered intellectual challenges that demanded serious consideration, the behavior and motivations of the locust preachers themselves raised questions about the practical consequences of accepting their teachings. Their apparent desire to convert others to their perspective, combined with their disturbing physical characteristics and their presence in the most corrupted depths of the ringed city, suggested that their version of enlightenment might come at costs that were not immediately apparent to potential converts. The relationship between the preachers and the broader ecosystem of the abyssal swamp provided additional context for evaluating their message and their credibility. They were not the only inhabitants of these depths, but shared their environment with creatures and phenomena that seemed to embody the most destructive and chaotic aspects of unconstrained darkness. The swamp itself pulsed with energies that felt malevolent and consuming, while the other beings that dwelt there exhibited behavior patterns that suggested hunger and aggression, rather than the gentle nurturing that the preachers described. This contradiction between the preached ideal of benevolent darkness and the observed reality of the dark realm raised fundamental questions about whether the preachers were describing possibilities that had been corrupted by external interference, or whether they were simply wrong about the nature of the forces they championed. Their claims about the original state of humanity and its relationship with darkness could not be independently verified, making it impossible to determine whether their version of events was historically accurate or merely a compelling interpretation of ambiguous evidence. The psychological impact of their sermons on those who heard them was itself a subject worthy of careful consideration. The promise of freedom from the constraints that defined mortal existence had obvious appeal to beings who struggled with the limitations and sufferings that characterized life under the current cosmic order. Yet this appeal might itself be a form of manipulation, exploiting natural desires for transcendence and transformation to encourage acceptance of doctrines whose true implications were far more dangerous than they initially appeared. The gradual sinking of the ringed city itself into the depths of the swamp served as a physical manifestation of the broader spiritual and metaphysical changes that were taking place within humanity's prison kingdom. As the centuries passed and the influence of the dark soul grew stronger despite Gwyn's efforts to contain it, the very foundations of the city began to respond to forces that operated according to principles very different from those that had guided its original construction. The architecture that had once stood proudly above ground began to settle and shift as the bedrock beneath it was transformed by energies that had more to do with the dreams and desires of its inhabitants than with ordinary geological processes. Buildings sank not because their foundations were physically inadequate, but because the reality in which they existed was gradually changing to accommodate forms of existence that required different kinds of support and structure. This physical transformation was accompanied by corresponding changes in the nature of the city's inhabitants, as prolonged exposure to the concentrated dark soul fragments began to manifest effects that had never been observed during the carefully controlled conditions of the early Age of Fire. The descendants of the Pygmy Lords began to exhibit characteristics and capabilities that their ancestors had never possessed, their consciousness expanding and evolving in directions that had previously been blocked by the artificial constraints that Gwyn's modifications had imposed. Yet these changes were not uniformly beneficial or desirable, as the same forces that enabled new forms of awareness and capability also created vulnerabilities, and instabilities that threatened the coherence and survival of individual consciousness. The line between transcendence and dissolution became increasingly difficult to maintain, as beings who had achieved expanded awareness found themselves struggling to retain sufficient individual identity to function as discrete entities. The corruption that affected even the city's greatest defender, Midir, demonstrated that not even beings of divine origin were immune to the transformative effects of prolonged exposure to unconstrained darkness. The dragon, who had been raised by the gods to serve as eternal guardian, gradually succumbed to influences that were stronger than his original programming, his noble purpose slowly overwhelmed by forces that operated according to principles he had never been designed to understand or resist. Midir's gradual fall into corruption represented one of the most tragic consequences of the cosmic struggle between light and darkness, as a being who had dedicated his entire existence to protecting others from the very forces that eventually claimed him, became himself a threat to those he had sworn to defend. His transformation from guardian to hazard illustrated the complex and often paradoxical nature of the relationship between consciousness and the powers that shaped it. The dragon's corruption was not a simple matter of moral failure or weakness of will, but resulted from exposure to forces that were fundamentally incompatible with the nature of his original construction and purpose. The same darkness that the locust preachers claimed was gentle and nurturing proved capable of overwhelming and destroying even the most carefully prepared and powerfully constructed defenses, when those defenses were based on principles that failed to account for the true nature of what they faced. This raised profound questions about whether any form of consciousness, no matter how noble or well-intentioned, could maintain its integrity when exposed to the pure and unmodified influence of the dark soul. If even Midir could be corrupted despite his divine origin and sacred purpose, what hope existed for ordinary mortals who lacked his advantages and protections? The answer to this question would prove to have implications that extended far beyond the fate of individual beings or even entire communities, touching upon the fundamental viability of consciousness itself as a stable and sustainable phenomenon. In a universe where the basic forces of existence operated according to principles that seemed hostile to the maintenance of discrete identity and coherent purpose, the moment that would shatter the foundations of time itself arrived not with fanfare or dramatic proclamation, but with the simple, devastating act of a hand closing around an object that had been protected for millennia beyond counting. When the egg that Princess Filianora had cradled against her breast through ages of slumber finally cracked beneath the pressure of mortal fingers, the sound that emerged was not merely the breaking of shell, but the fracturing of reality's most carefully maintained barriers. The chamber that had served as the princess's sanctuary for so long began to dissolve around the figure who had dared to disturb her eternal rest, its walls and ceiling crumbling away like a dream that could no longer sustain itself in the harsh light of waking consciousness. Yet what was revealed as the sacred space collapsed was not the continuation of the ringed city that lay beyond its borders, but something far more terrible and final than any who had entered that chamber could have imagined. The world that emerged from the breaking of Filianor's protective enchantment was one that had been stripped of all illusion and comfortable deception, a realm where the true passage of time could finally be perceived without the softening filters that the princess's slumber had maintained. Here was reality as it truly existed at the end of all ages, when the last flames had guttered out and the final pretenses of order had been abandoned to the inevitable entropy that claimed all things. The landscape that stretched away in all directions from the ruins of the princess's chamber was a wasteland of ash and bone, where the accumulated detritus of countless civilizations lay scattered beneath skies that had forgotten the meaning of light or color. The very air seemed thick with the dust of ages, each breath carrying within it the final exhalations of worlds that had once burned bright with hope and ambition, but had long since been reduced to nothing more than memories held in the failing consciousness of the last witnesses to their passing. This was not merely the end of the ringed city, or even the conclusion of the Age of Fire, but the ultimate destination toward which all of creation had been moving since the first flames had banished the grey twilight of the Age of Ancients. Every kingdom that had risen and fallen, every hero who had fought and died, every dream that had been dreamed, and every song that had been sung, had been steps along a path that led inevitably to this final desolation. The silence that pressed down upon this terminal landscape was more profound than any mere absence of sound, for it represented the cessation of all the processes and activities that had once given meaning to existence itself. There were no more voices to speak or sing, no more footsteps to echo through empty halls, no more heartbeats to mark the passage of moments that had themselves lost all significance in a world where time had finally run out. Yet in this realm of absolute ending, where hope itself had been reduced to ash and scattered on winds that no longer carried the scent of living things, there moved a single figure whose very presence defied the finality that surrounded him on all sides. Gale, the slave knight, who had somehow endured when gods had fallen and kingdoms had crumbled to dust, continued his impossible quest with a determination that transcended reason or sanity. The knight who wandered through this wasteland bore little resemblance to the humble servant who had once labored in obscurity within the halls of divine palaces. The long centuries of his existence had transformed him into something that existed at the boundaries between mortal and monster, hero and horror, salvation and damnation. His armor, once the simple gear of a common soldier, had been reshaped by forces beyond ordinary understanding into something that seemed to incorporate elements from every age through which he had lived. The weapon he carried was no longer a mere sword, but had become an extension of his own tormented essence, its blade wreathed in energies that spoke of the countless battles he had fought across the length and breadth of time itself. Every strike he had made in service to his impossible mission had left its mark upon the weapon, until it had become less a tool than a repository of accumulated pain and desperate purpose. Gale's face, when glimpses of it could be seen beneath the hood that shadowed his features, showed the strain of bearing witness to the death of everything he had once known and loved. His eyes held depths of sorrow that no mortal soul had ever been designed to contain, while the lines that marked his features spoke of ages spent in contemplation of losses that could never be recovered or redeemed. Yet for all the transformation that time and suffering had wrought upon his physical form, the essential nature of his character remained unchanged. He was still, at the deepest level of his being, the same humble knight who had dedicated his existence to serving others, who had never sought glory or recognition for himself, but had found his greatest satisfaction in the knowledge that his efforts might somehow ease the burdens carried by those he protected. The quest that had brought him to this place, at the end of all things, was perhaps the most paradoxical mission that any being had ever undertaken, for he sought to gather and preserve the very essence of humanity itself at the moment when humanity was finally passing from existence. The dark soul that had been divided among the children of the furtive pygmy countless ages ago had itself begun to fade as the last of its carriers succumbed to the inexorable forces of time and entropy. The pygmy lords who had once ruled the ringed city with wisdom and justice had long since been reduced to desiccated husks that crumbled at the slightest touch, their once mighty souls having dried to nothing more than fragments of crystallized essence that barely retained enough coherence to remember what they had once been. These pathetic remnants of former greatness lay scattered throughout the ruins of their former kingdom like fallen leaves from trees that had been dead for seasons beyond counting. It was these fragments that Gael sought to collect and preserve, not for his own aggrandizement or power, but in service to a mission that transcended his own existence and touched upon the continuation of consciousness itself in forms that might yet survive the ending of the current cosmic cycle. He moved through the wasteland with the methodical patience of one who understood that his task might take not merely years or decades but entire ages to complete, and who had already resigned himself to whatever personal costs such dedication might demand. The irony of his situation was both profound and heartbreaking, for in seeking to preserve the essence of humanity for the sake of others, Gael had gradually been forced to surrender his own humanity piece by piece. Each fragment of the dark soul that he absorbed into his being changed him in ways that moved him further from the humble knight he had once been, and closer to something that ordinary mortals would struggle to recognize as having ever been, one of their own kind. The transformation was not merely physical, but touched upon the fundamental nature of consciousness itself, as the accumulated power of countless dark soul fragments began to overwhelm the individual identity that had once defined him as a discrete being. The gentle knight who had served others with quiet devotion was slowly being subsumed into something vast and terrible, a repository of human essence that grew stronger and more dangerous with each passing moment. Yet even as this transformation progressed and threatened to erase everything that had made Gael the person he had been, his essential purpose remained clear and unwavering. He would continue his collection of dark soul fragments, no matter what personal cost might be demanded, driven by a dedication that had survived the destruction of worlds and would endure until the very last ember of consciousness had been safely preserved for whatever future might yet be possible. The landscape through which he traveled bore witness to the magnitude of the collapse that had befallen not merely the ringed city, but the entire structure of reality that had sustained the Age of Fire and all the ages that had preceded to it. The ruins that dotted the wasteland were not merely the remains of buildings and monuments, but the physical manifestations of broken dreams and failed aspirations, each pile of rubble representing hopes and ambitions that had once seemed as eternal as the stones from which they had been constructed. Here lay the remnants of libraries that had once contained the accumulated wisdom of civilizations, their knowledge now reduced to ash and scattered fragments that the wind carried to destinations where no eyes would ever read them again. There stood the broken foundations of temples where countless souls had once sought communion with forces greater than themselves, their prayers now echoing only in the memories of beings who no longer possessed the capacity to answer them. The very ground beneath Gael's feet was composed of layers upon layers of such ruins, each stratum representing an entire age or epoch that had once seemed permanent and unchangeable, but had eventually succumbed to the same forces of decay and dissolution that claimed all things. To walk across this terminal landscape was to traverse the compressed history of existence itself, every step covering distances that had once required lifetimes to cross. Yet it was not merely the physical remnants of past glories that marked this place as the ultimate destination of all journeys, but the spiritual and emotional residue that clung to every surface like a patina of accumulated sorrow. The very air seemed to carry within it the final thoughts and feelings of all who had ever lived and died. Their hopes and fears and loves and hatreds mingled together into an atmosphere so thick with meaning that breathing itself became an act of communion with the entirety of conscious experience. In this environment where past and present had collapsed into a single eternal moment of ending, the distinction between memory and immediate experience became increasingly difficult to maintain. Gael found himself reliving not only his own long existence but fragments of lives he had never lived, experiences that belonged to the dark soul fragments he had absorbed, and which now contributed their own perspectives and emotions to the composite being he was becoming. The psychological strain of containing so many different identities and histories within a single consciousness was beyond anything that mortal minds had ever been designed to endure. Yet Gale persisted in his mission with a determination that seemed to draw its strength from sources deeper than individual will or personal conviction. He had become, in effect, a living repository of human experience, carrying within himself the essence of countless souls who would otherwise have been lost forever to the silence that was claiming all things. The encounters he had with the few other beings who still moved through this wasteland were brief and often wordless, for there was little that could be said in a place where all the grand narratives and meaningful purposes that had once given structure to existence had finally revealed themselves as temporary constructions that could not survive the purposes, ultimate test of time. Those who had endured to witness the end of all things found themselves face to face with questions that had no comfortable answers and truths that offered no hope of consolation or redemption. Some of these final witnesses had achieved a form of peace through acceptance of the inevitable, finding in the very hopelessness of their situation a kind of liberation from the burdens of expectation and responsibility that had once defined their existence. Others had been driven to madness by the magnitude of what they had witnessed, their minds unable to process the complete negation of everything they had once believed to be permanent and meaningful. Gale himself occupied a position somewhere between these extremes, maintaining enough sanity to continue his mission while accepting the reality of what that mission was costing him in terms of personal identity and individual consciousness. He had become a being dedicated entirely to service, his own desires and preferences gradually erased by the weight of the responsibility he had accepted and the power he had absorbed in pursuit of goals that transcended any individual existence. The knowledge that his quest might ultimately prove futile, that the dark soul fragments he collected might not be sufficient to kindle new life in whatever realm might emerge from the ashes of the current one, did not deter him from continuing his work with the same methodical dedication that had characterized his service throughout all the ages of his existence. He understood that the value of his efforts lay not in their guaranteed success, but in the attempt itself, in the refusal to surrender hope, even when hope itself seemed to have become meaningless. The transformation that was gradually claiming him as he absorbed more and more dark soul fragments was not merely a change in his physical form or even his mental capabilities, but a fundamental alteration in the nature of his relationship to existence itself. He was becoming something that existed partially outside the normal categories of individual consciousness, a being whose identity was increasingly defined not by personal characteristics, but by the collective essence of all the human souls he had gathered within himself. This process of transformation created a paradox that lay at the very heart of his mission. For in order to preserve humanity, he was being forced to surrender his own humanity, becoming something that human eyes would no longer recognize as one of their own kind. The knight who had begun his quest as the most humble and self-effacing of servants was evolving into something vast and terrible, a creature whose very presence would inspire fear and revulsion in the same beings he sought to save. Yet even as this terrible irony unfolded and threatened to transform him into the very thing that humanity might need protection from, Gale continued his work with the same quiet dedication that had always characterized his service. He had long since moved beyond questions of personal cost or individual suffering, his existence having become a function rather than a life, a process rather than an experience. The final confrontation that awaited him at the culmination of his quest would test not only his remaining humanity, but the very foundations of consciousness itself, as he faced the ultimate question of whether love and dedication could survive the complete transformation of everything that had originally given them meaning and purpose. In the countless ages that had passed since the first flames had banished the grey twilight of the primordial world, Few beings had embodied the essential nature of service quite like Gael, whose very existence seemed to have been shaped by forces that valued dedication above personal ambition and humility above the pursuit of glory. His origins lay not in the halls of power or the centers of learning that had produced so many of the heroes whose names echoed through the chronicles of the Age of Fire, but in the humble quarters where those who served others lived lives of quiet devotion that rarely attracted notice or acclaim. The slave knight, as he had come to be known, bore a title that spoke not of bondage or subjugation in any cruel or demeaning sense, but of a voluntary surrender of personal will that had transformed service from mere occupation into a form of spiritual practice that touched upon the deepest mysteries of conscious existence. He had chosen to dedicate his life to purposes greater than himself, not because he lacked the capacity for independent thought or action, but because he had discovered in selfless service a form of meaning that transcended anything that individual achievement could provide. His relationship with the painter, that mysterious figure whose work would prove crucial to the continuation of consciousness beyond the boundaries of the current cosmic cycle, represented one of the most profound bonds that could exist between beings whose natures were fundamentally different, yet whose purposes were perfectly aligned. The young artist, whose visions encompassed possibilities that extended far beyond the limitations of the dying world, inhabited a realm of imagination and creative potential that Gael could never fully enter. Yet his dedication to her work and his understanding of its importance made him the perfect guardian for someone whose gifts required protection that only the most devoted service could provide. The painter's world existed primarily in potential rather than actuality, a realm of artistic vision that awaited the materials and conditions necessary to transform creative inspiration into tangible reality. Her work required not merely technical skill or artistic sensitivity, but access to pigments and essences that could only be obtained from sources that lay beyond the reach of ordinary mortals, substances that captured within their very composition the fundamental forces that shaped existence itself. The most crucial of these materials was the dark soul of man, that essence which had been divided among the children of the furtive pygmy in ages past, and which now existed in forms so scattered and diminished that gathering sufficient quantities to serve the painter's needs would require a quest of unprecedented scope and duration. This was the mission that Gael had accepted with the same quiet determination that had characterized all of his service, understanding that success would demand not merely years or decades, but entire lifetimes of dedicated effort. The irony inherent in his quest was both profound and tragic, for the very essence he sought to preserve and gather was gradually consuming and transforming him in ways that moved him further from the humanity he sought to serve with each fragment he absorbed. The dark soul of man was not merely a source of power or creative potential, but a force that carried within it the accumulated experiences, desires, and characteristics of all who had ever possessed it, and prolonged exposure to such concentrated essence inevitably left its mark upon any consciousness that attempted to contain it. The changes that began to manifest in Gael as his quest progressed were subtle at first, barely perceptible alterations in behavior and perspective that might have been attributed to the natural effects of time and experience, rather than to any fundamental transformation of his essential nature. He became more solitary in his habits, spending long periods in contemplation or meditation that seemed to serve purposes beyond mere rest or reflection, as if he were engaging in internal dialogues with voices that only he could hear. His movements acquired a quality of deliberation and care that suggested an awareness of possessing strength and capabilities that required constant monitoring to prevent accidental harm to his surroundings or companions. The simple gestures and everyday actions that had once been performed without conscious thought now seemed to require his full attention, as if the relationship between his intentions and their physical expression had become more complex and potentially dangerous. The weapon he carried, once a simple sword suited to his station as a knight of modest rank and unremarkable capabilities, began to exhibit properties that reflected the changes occurring within its wielder. The blade's metal took on a darker hue that seemed to absorb rather than reflect light, while its edge acquired a keenness that could cut through substances that should have been immune to conventional weapons, as if the sword itself had become infused with the same essence that was transforming the one who bore it. Yet even as these physical manifestations of his growing power became more apparent, Gale's essential character remained unchanged in ways that testified to the strength of his original dedication and the depth of his commitment to serving others. His courtesy toward those he encountered never faltered, his willingness to aid those in need never diminished, and his fundamental humility never gave way to the pride or arrogance that might have been expected from one who wielded such increasing might. The psychological strain of containing multiple dark soul fragments within a single consciousness was beyond anything that mortal minds had been designed to endure. Yet Gale bore this burden with the same stoic acceptance that had characterized his approach to every other hardship he had encountered throughout his long existence. He understood that the voices and memories that now crowded his thoughts were not invaders or parasites, but the remnants of souls who had once been as real and complete as he himself, beings whose experiences and perspectives deserved respect, even as their presence threatened to overwhelm his own identity. The gradual erosion of the boundaries between self and other, between individual consciousness and collective essence, created challenges that went beyond mere psychological discomfort to touch upon the fundamental nature of personal identity itself. Gale found himself experiencing memories that belonged to lives he had never lived, feeling emotions that originated in hearts that had ceased beating long before his own quest had begun, and understanding truths about the nature of existence that could only have been learned through experiences he had never personally undergone. This expansion of consciousness brought with it insights and capabilities that would have been invaluable to any ordinary person seeking to understand their place in the cosmic order. Yet for Gale, these gifts came at the cost of everything that had previously defined him as an individual being. The humble knight who had begun this quest with clear knowledge of his own identity and purpose was gradually being replaced by something vast and composite, a collective consciousness that contained elements from countless different souls, while struggling to maintain sufficient coherence to continue functioning as a discrete entity. The most terrifying aspect of this transformation was not the loss of individual identity, devastating though that was, but the growing awareness that the process might be irreversible and that success in his mission might require him to surrender completely everything that had made him the person capable of undertaking such a quest in the first place. The dark soul fragments he collected demanded not merely physical containment, but integration with his own essence, and each such integration moved him further from his original nature, while making it more difficult to resist the changes that were claiming him. The hunger that began to manifest as his transformation progressed was unlike anything that ordinary beings experienced in their relationship with food or other physical needs. This was a craving that operated at the level of consciousness itself, a driving need to seek out and absorb additional dark soul fragments, not because they were required for his mission, but because the composite being he was becoming could no longer exist without the constant addition of new essence to maintain its cohesion and stability. What had begun as a voluntary quest undertaken in service to another's needs had gradually evolved into a compulsion that operated according to its own logic and priorities, transforming Gale from a free agent, choosing to serve, into something more akin to a force of nature, driven by imperatives that transcended individual will or rational decision-making. The knight who had once been capable of setting aside his own needs for the sake of others was becoming something that might eventually threaten the very beings he sought to serve. As the hunger for dark soul fragments grew stronger and more demanding with each passing day, the tragic irony of his situation became most apparent in his interactions with the few other beings who still moved through the dying world at the end of all ages. Those who encountered him in his increasingly monstrous form could not see the gentle knight who still existed somewhere within the composite entity he was becoming, but perceived only a creature of terrible power and barely contained violence whose very presence seemed to threaten everything they held dear about the nature of conscious existence. Yet from Gale's perspective, these encounters were opportunities to gather the very essence that would eventually serve to create new life and new possibilities for consciousness to flourish in whatever realm the painter's work might bring into being. The fragments he collected from each being he met were not trophies of conquest, but precious materials that would serve creative purposes far beyond anything the current world could accomplish, seeds of potential that would blossom into forms of existence that the dying cosmos could no longer sustain. The conflict between these two perspectives, between the apparent monstrosity of his actions and the noble purpose that drove them, created a form of moral complexity that defied easy resolution or comfortable judgment. Was Gale a hero whose dedication to serving others had led him to make the ultimate sacrifice of his own humanity? Or had he become the very thing that humanity needed protection from? A creature whose hunger for dark soul essence made him more dangerous than any conventional enemy? The answer to this question lay not in any simple categorization of his actions as good or evil, but in the recognition that he had become something that existed beyond the normal boundaries of such distinctions, a being whose nature encompassed both the highest aspirations of selfless service and the most terrifying possibilities of unconstrained power. He was simultaneously savior and destroyer, protector and threat, the guardian of humanity's future and the agent of its final dissolution. The weapon he wielded in his transformed state was no longer merely a sword, but had become an extension of his own essence, a tool that could channel the accumulated power of all the dark soul fragments he had absorbed, while serving as a focus for the complex emotions and memories that those fragments carried within them. Each strike he made in combat was informed not only by his own skill and experience, but by the collective wisdom and technique of countless warriors whose essence had become part of his own being. Yet even as this transformation granted him capabilities that far exceeded anything he had possessed in his original form, it also created vulnerabilities and instabilities that made him increasingly difficult to control or predict. The composite consciousness he had become was pulled in multiple directions by the conflicting desires and motivations of its component parts, creating internal tensions that sometimes manifested in behavior that seemed to contradict his original noble intentions. The love that had motivated his original acceptance of this quest remained at the core of his being, even as that being underwent fundamental changes that threatened to make such emotions meaningless or impossible to maintain. His dedication to the painter and her work served as an anchor that prevented complete dissolution into the collective essence he carried, yet even this most essential aspect of his identity was gradually being worn away by the sheer weight of the consciousness he had absorbed. The final phase of his transformation would test not only his remaining humanity, but the very possibility of maintaining individual purpose and dedication in the face of complete dissolution of the boundaries that normally separated one consciousness from another. The question of whether love itself could survive such radical transformation would prove to be one of the most crucial tests of the nature of consciousness, and its relationship to the forces that shaped existence itself. The confrontation that awaited him at the culmination of his quest would force him to face not only external enemies, but the internal contradiction that had been building throughout his long journey, as the gentle knight who sought to serve others came into conflict with the composite entity that hungered for the very essence of those he wished to protect. The resolution of this conflict would determine not merely his own fate, but the possibility of consciousness itself finding new forms of expression in whatever reality might emerge from the ashes of the dying world. At the very edge of existence, where the final grains of sand had fallen through time's hourglass and the last echoes of creation were fading into silence, there began a confrontation that would serve as both epilogue and prologue to the vast cosmic drama that had unfolded across countless ages. This was not merely a battle between two warriors who had endured beyond all reasonable expectation, but a collision between different visions of what consciousness might become when stripped of all the comfortable illusions and familiar structures that had previously given it meaning and purpose. The unkindled who approached through the wasteland of ash and bone carried within their being the accumulated experience of trials that had tested every aspect of mortal endurance and divine aspiration. They had witnessed the fall of kingdoms and the death of gods, had seen the corruption of the noblest purposes, and the triumph of forces that seemed to embody the very essence of entropy and dissolution. Yet they had persisted through all of these trials, driven by purposes that transcended individual survival and touched upon the fundamental question of whether consciousness itself deserved to continue existing in any form. The creature that awaited them at the world's end bore little resemblance to the humble knight who had once served others with such quiet dedication that his very existence had been overlooked by those who chronicled the great deeds of more prominent heroes. Gale had become something that existed at the boundaries between the individual and the collective, between the personal and the universal, between the human and the divine. His form incorporated elements that spoke of every stage of conscious evolution, from the most primitive drives that had motivated the first beings to crawl from darkness into light, to the most sophisticated aspirations that had driven civilizations to reach toward transcendence. The weapon he wielded was no longer merely a tool for combat, but had become a repository of accumulated suffering and desperate hope, its blade wreathed in energies that seemed to contain within them the final thoughts and feelings of every soul whose essence had been absorbed into the composite being he had become. Each swing of that terrible sword carried with it not only devastating physical force, but the weight of countless lives that had been surrendered in service to a vision of continuation that lay beyond the reach of ordinary understanding. The battle that commenced between these two figures was fought on multiple levels simultaneously, as physical combat served as the external manifestation of a deeper struggle between different conceptions of what it meant to exist as a conscious entity in a universe that had revealed itself to be fundamentally hostile to the maintenance of individual identity and coherent purpose. Each exchange of blows was also an exchange of philosophies, each defensive maneuver a statement about the nature of survival and the value of persistence in the face of overwhelming opposition. The unkindled fought with the precision and determination of one who had been forged by trials that had stripped away every unnecessary element of their being, leaving only the essential core of purpose that had somehow proven stronger than despair and more enduring than hope itself. Their movements spoke of lessons learned through suffering that had transcended the merely personal to become insights into the fundamental nature of existence and the possibilities that might yet emerge from apparent ending. Gael's attacks carried the fury and desperation of one who had sacrificed everything he had once been in service to purposes that demanded total commitment while offering no guarantee of success or even comprehension. The composite consciousness he had become fought with the accumulated skill and experience of countless warriors whose essence had been integrated into his being. Yet this very multiplicity created instabilities and contradictions that made his behavior unpredictable and sometimes self-defeating. The arena in which their conflict played out was itself a testament to the magnitude of what hung in the balance, for the wasteland that stretched away in all directions was not merely the remains of a single world or civilization, but the compressed residue of every possible form that conscious existence had ever taken. The very ground beneath their feet was composed of layers upon layers of crystallized dreams and fossilized aspirations, each stratum representing entire epochs of struggle and achievement that had ultimately been reduced to nothing more than the raw materials from which something new might eventually be constructed. The sky above them burned with colors that had no names in any living language, auroras of energy that represented the final dissolution of the cosmic forces that had maintained the structure of reality throughout all the ages that had preceded this ultimate confrontation. These displays of impossible beauty served as reminders that even in endings there could be forms of magnificence that transcended anything that ordinary existence could produce, phenomena that could only emerge when all constraints and limitations had finally been stripped away. As the battle progressed and both combatants began to show signs of the tremendous strain that such a conflict imposed upon beings who were already operating at the very limits of what consciousness could endure, the true nature of what they represented began to emerge with increasing clarity. This was not simply a fight between two individuals who happened to find themselves in opposition, but a fundamental test of whether individual identity could maintain its integrity when confronted with forces that sought to dissolve all boundaries and merge all separate consciousnesses into a single collective entity. The Unkindled embodied the principle of personal autonomy and individual purpose, fighting not merely for their own survival, but for the right of conscious beings to maintain their separate identities, even in the face of cosmic forces that seemed to demand unity and integration. Their very existence was a testament to the possibility that individual will and determination could prove stronger than the entropic forces that sought to reduce all complexity to simple uniformity. Gale represented the opposing principle of collective consciousness and shared essence, having voluntarily surrendered his individual identity in service to a vision of continuation that required the dissolution of all separate beings into a single composite entity that could carry forward the accumulated experience and wisdom of the entire species. His transformation was both a sacrifice and an achievement, demonstrating that love and dedication could motivate individuals to transcend the limitations of personal existence in service to purposes greater than themselves. The philosophical implications of their conflict extended far beyond the immediate question of who would emerge victorious from their physical confrontation, touching upon fundamental questions about the nature of consciousness and its relationship to the forces that shaped existence itself. Was individual identity an essential characteristic of conscious beings that must be preserved at all costs? Or was it merely a temporary stage in the evolution of awareness that could be transcended without loss of what was truly valuable about consciousness? The answer to this question could not be determined through philosophical debate or theoretical speculation, but only through the kind of ultimate test that their battle represented, where abstract principles were given concrete form and forced to prove their worth through the most rigorous examination possible. The outcome would determine not merely the fate of the two combatants, but the direction that any future evolution of consciousness might take. As the fight reached its climax, and both participants began to tap into reserves of strength and determination that they had not known they possessed, the wasteland around them began to respond to the tremendous energies being unleashed by their conflict. The accumulated ash and bone that covered the landscape started to stir and swirl, as if the very remains of the dead civilizations were being called back into some form of participation in this final determination of what their legacy might become. The dark blood that began to flow from wounds inflicted by weapons that could cut through the very essence of being was not merely a sign of physical damage, but represented the spillage of concentrated consciousness itself, drops of pure awareness that fell to the barren ground and immediately began to germinate with possibilities that had never before existed in any form. This was the blood of the dark soul itself, the fundamental substance from which all human consciousness had originally been formed, now being released from the artificial constraints and modifications that had shaped its development throughout the entire Age of Fire. Each drop that touched the earth created tiny explosions of potential that manifested as brief glimpses of what might yet be possible if consciousness were freed from all the limitations and restrictions that had previously defined its boundaries and capabilities. These visions were not merely hopeful fantasies, but genuine previews of forms of existence that could emerge from the raw materials being provided by the sacrifice of those who fought to determine the future direction of conscious evolution. The Ringed City's mysteries, which had remained hidden and suppressed throughout all the long ages of its existence, were finally being revealed through this ultimate confrontation between the forces that sought to preserve individual identity and those that pursued collective transcendence. The truth that had been concealed behind walls and barriers and carefully maintained illusions was that consciousness itself was not a fixed and unchangeable phenomenon, but something that could be transformed and evolved in directions that had never previously been explored or imagined. The prison that humanity had inhabited since the earliest days of the Age of Fire had not merely been a physical confinement, but a limitation imposed upon the very nature of human consciousness, preventing it from developing along the paths that its essential characteristics would naturally have led it to explore. The dark soul fragments that had been carefully contained and controlled were not sources of corruption or destruction, but seeds of possibility that had been prevented from achieving their full flowering by the fears and prejudices of those who could not imagine forms of existence different from their own. The battle between undead and unkindled was therefore not merely a conflict between two individuals, but a confrontation between the artificial constraints that had shaped the development of consciousness throughout the Age of Fire and the Flames. Natural tendencies that had been suppressed and contained, but never truly eliminated. The outcome would determine whether the future would be built upon the foundations of the past, or would represent a genuinely new beginning that transcended all previous limitations and explored possibilities that had never before been accessible to conscious beings. The significance of this confrontation extended beyond even the cosmic implications it carried for the future of consciousness itself, for it represented the first time in the entire history of existence that beings had been forced to confront the fundamental question of what they truly were and what they might become if freed from all external constraints and artificial limitations. The answers that emerged from this trial would not merely determine the fate of the combatants, but would establish the principles that would guide any future development of conscious existence. As the battle reached its final phase, and both participants began to draw upon resources that transcended anything they had previously believed themselves to possess, the very nature of the conflict began to change from a competition between opposing forces to a collaboration in the creation of something entirely new. The dark blood that flowed from their wounds was beginning to pool and coalesce, forming patterns and structures that suggested the emergence of possibilities that neither individual consciousness nor collective absorption could have achieved alone. The wasteland that had seemed to represent nothing but ending and dissolution was being transformed by their struggle into a fertile ground from which new forms of existence could emerge, possibilities that incorporated elements from both individual autonomy and collective integration, while transcending the limitations that had previously made these approaches seem mutually exclusive. The spilled essence of the dark soul was serving as the raw material from which entirely new forms of conscious existence could be constructed, forms that had never before been possible under the constraints that had defined all previous cosmic cycles. The revelation that emerged from this ultimate confrontation was that the cycle itself, the endless repetition of light and dark, fire and shadow, individual and collective, had been an artificial construct that could be transcended through the willing sacrifice of those who understood that some purposes were worth the surrender of everything they had previously believed themselves to be. The new world that would emerge from the dark blood of their struggle would not be subject to the limitations and repetitions that had characterized all previous forms of existence, but would represent a genuine breakthrough into possibilities that had never before been explored or imagined. The final understanding that dawned as the battle reached its conclusion was that neither the preservation of individual identity nor the pursuit of collective transcendence represented the ultimate truth about the nature of consciousness, but that both were partial insights into a larger reality that could only be fully realized through their synthesis into something that contained elements of both while being limited by neither. The dark soul that had been divided and fragmented and constrained throughout all the ages of its existence was finally being reunited, not through absorption or conquest, but through a form of creative collaboration that honored both its individual components and its collective potential. And so we reached the end of our journey through the deepest mysteries that lay hidden within the ringed city's walls, having witnessed truths that challenged everything we thought we understood about the nature of light and shadow, gods and mortals, freedom and imprisonment. The story we have traced together spans the entire arc of conscious existence, from the first moments when humble creatures crawled from darkness to claim the power of flame, to the final confrontation where all illusions were stripped away, and the fundamental questions about the nature of being were answered not through words but through the ultimate sacrifice of those who loved enough to surrender everything they had once been. The revelations that emerged from humanity's prison sanctuary have shown us that the cycle which had defined existence for so many ages was not an eternal truth but an artificial construct, maintained through fear and misunderstanding by those who could not imagine possibilities beyond the limitations of their own experience. The dark soul that had been feared and contained and branded with marks of fire was revealed to be not a source of corruption, but the seed of transformation, carrying within it potential for forms of consciousness that transcended the boundaries between individual and collective, mortal and divine, finite and infinite. Princess Filianor's endless slumber, maintained across centuries through sacrifice that touched the very foundations of reality, had preserved more than just the stability of a dying world. Her vigil had created the conditions necessary for consciousness itself to evolve beyond the constraints that had previously defined its possibilities, allowing the final confrontation between undead and unkindled to serve as both ending and beginning, conclusion and genesis. The dark blood that flowed from that ultimate battle did not represent death or destruction, but the birth of something entirely new, possibilities that had been growing and developing in the hidden spaces between dream and waking, between memory and hope, between what was and what might yet be. From this essence, the painter would create not merely another world, but an entirely different form of existence, one that honored both the individual spark that made each consciousness unique and the collective wisdom that could only emerge when separate beings chose to share their deepest truths. Gale's transformation from humble knight to cosmic repository of human essence had demonstrated that love itself could survive any change, any sacrifice, any dissolution of the boundaries that normally separated self from other. His willingness to become something terrible in service to something beautiful had proven that the highest forms of devotion transcended the comfortable categories through which ordinary beings understood morality and meaning. The spears of the church, the guardians and defenders who had chosen exile and eternal service over the false promises of individual fulfillment, had shown that dedication to purposes greater than oneself could create forms of community and meaning that survived even the ending of worlds. Their sacrifice had preserved not merely the sleeping princess, but the possibility that consciousness could find new ways of expressing itself that honored both personal autonomy and collective responsibility. As you rest in the gentle embrace of approaching sleep, let yourself imagine not the wasteland of ash and bone that marked the ending of one cosmic cycle, but the garden of infinite possibility that was being born from the dark soil of willing sacrifice. Dream not of the prisons that had contained humanity's potential for so long, but of the freedom that awaited consciousness when all artificial barriers had finally been dissolved. The Ringed City's mysteries have been revealed at last, showing us that even in the darkest depths of apparent defeat, even when all hope seemed lost and all purposes seemed meaningless, the seeds of renewal were quietly growing, waiting for the moment when they could blossom into forms of beauty and meaning that surpassed anything that had come before. Rest now in the knowledge that endings are also beginnings, that every prison contains the keys to its own liberation, and that love, in its truest and most complete expression, transcends every boundary that fear and misunderstanding can construct. The cycle is finally broken, and consciousness is free to explore possibilities that stretch beyond the horizon of imagination itself.